What I want to focus on is a particular question, which is what's special about the Palestinian struggle? Why can it not simply be normalised? Why did the Palestinians not simply disappear as a people, which is clearly what a whole layer of people at the top of the Israeli state want, not just now. We're not just talking about people like Smotrich and Netanyahu, but we're also talking about the founders of the Israeli state, for example, Golda Meir, who desperately wanted the Palestinians to disappear as people 70, 80, 90 years ago. And they haven't. And one of the arguments that I want to put forward, really, is that there are three parts to try to answer this question. Firstly, that we can talk about the Palestinian struggle in a sense of being unfinished business from the anti-colonial revolutions. It combines three types of revolutionary challenge: the anti-colonial or national revolution, a democratic revolution against an authoritarian and racist state, and has within it the seeds of what could be a much broader and deeper revolutionary process, a social revolution against the system of capital accumulation. And this unfinished business on three levels, three aspects of the Palestinian struggle, this combined revolutionary potential in the Palestinian struggle, is one of the reasons why, though the Palestinians do not disappear as a people, it's to do with the fact that their resilience and courage, their resistance, their self-organisation is, of course, something that Palestinians have brought from within themselves, from their own movements, from their struggles and their day-to-day lives. But it's also because it is part of a much wider set of questions about, and not just the entire region, but actually something that's of significance on a global scale. And that the centrality of the Palestinian struggle, the way that the world works today, is not something that is just about the fact that it's on the news, the fact that there's a big movement about it in this country. It's also to do with the way that the Palestinian struggle is embedded at the centre of resisting a system that is part of is shaped by imperialist competition over the resources of the Middle East, and in particular, specifically, the resources of oil. That if we want to understand the prospects for the Palestinian revolution, we have to see that it is facing a settler colonial project of the Zionist state, which has survived precisely because that state, the Israeli state, made itself indispensable to a whole system of imperialism in the region, and therefore actually to what you could call a global order of fossil imperialism, to play on the climate activist and author Andreas Malm talks about fossil capitalism. You could talk about fossil imperialism as well. He's talking about how fossil fuels are embedded in the way that capitalism works. So therefore, the Palestinian struggle, because it has the potential to break apart that whole system, or if it develops in a particular way, it could break apart that whole system, as it plays a system-wide and structuring role. I do want to emphasise the importance of Palestinians' own struggles in this, because there's sometimes when you talk about things at a level of the dynamics of imperialism and political economy of the region and so on, then actually the actions of ordinary people can disappear out of the picture. And I think this is a great mistake, because you have to always have rooted in your conception of revolution the idea that this is something that we make ourselves, that ordinary people make on a mass scale, on a scale of millions and billions. And that actually those smaller things that we do in our workplaces, in the streets, in our neighbourhoods, are the things that will shake those much greater powers. But at the basic question, it is a question, you have to pose the question of state power. In fact, I'm quoting Lenin, Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin, who wrote in April the 9th, 1917, the basic question of every revolution is that of state power. Unless this question is understood, there can be no intelligent participation in the revolution, not to speak of guidance of the revolution. So in what ways is the Palestinian revolution a question of state power? I'd say there are two ways you could conceive of this. Firstly, you could think about the Palestinian revolution as a struggle to found a state, to make a state. Or you could think about it as a struggle to break a state, to break the Israeli state. Another way of thinking about this is it about breaking into a regional order of states, so creating a space for Palestine alongside the other states of the region, or to break apart the existing Israeli state and the whole infrastructure of states in the region. I want to argue that if you conceive of the goals of the Palestinian revolution as limited to either simply a national revolution to found a sovereign national Palestinian state, or even actually a political revolution, a democratic revolution to create a democratic state in the place of the undemocratic, authoritarian, racist, settler colonial state that is there today, it fails to take into account why the Israeli state exists and why it takes the specific form, the specific apartheid form, why it persists as a settler colonial state long after many other states of that particular character have disappeared. And that failing to connect up the social dimension of the Palestinian revolution with the national and the democratic parts of it is something that's actually has led to the Palestinian movement often ending up going down a dead end of trying to, for example, accommodate the two-state solution paradigm, and so on and so forth, and abandoning many of the weapons that were needed, political weapons that were needed to overcome its opponents. And the struggle to break the state, the apartheid state, only makes sense and can only be realised if it's part of a regional struggle. We're not talking about the state in the singular, but a system of states and a regional structure of capital accumulation. So it's about the way that the resources of the region are taken over and used for the benefit of ruling classes in the region and specifically also ruling classes around the world, including our own. The Palestinian revolution has always had a social soul, if you like. It's always been partly a struggle by the poor of Palestinian society, by workers, Palestinian workers, and so on. And they've often been the people in the forefront of leading this, whether they're dispossessed of the refugee camps or the workers of Gaza who launched the first Intifada back in 1987. So let's just talk through a few of these points about who is the target of this revolutionary struggle. It's very important to say to talk here about that. The state that Palestinians are confronting is not one that is a classic kind of settler colonial state or settler colonial state of the types that were found earlier in the 20th century, which tended to focus on, for example, agricultural, the exploitation of native agricultural labour and producing agricultural products for export. That was part of the Zionist economic policy, was to do that, precisely that, at various points. But it's not the most dynamic part of the Israeli economy today by a long chalk. And in fact, as will be said in other meetings, the Zionist the Zionist movement from the beginning argued very strongly in favour of excluding Palestinian labour from large parts of the economy, and effected that. The place where Palestinians' labour is excluded that is the most important to the Israeli economy is, of course, the high-tech sector. And that one of the changes that's taken place in the Israeli economy over the last 20, 30 years has been the rise of that high-tech sector, which is essentially an outgrowth of the American military-industrial complex in many ways. It was subsidised by the military-industrial complex in America, but it's made the leap to becoming an independent centre of capital accumulation, quite a dynamic one at that. I was just reading reports from the IMF yesterday. The Israeli high-tech industry contributes, the vast majority of exports from the Israeli economy are driven by the high-tech sector, by services, 56%, up from 37% only a decade or so ago. Israel sucked in huge amounts of capital investment for high-tech industries in the last year. It was one of the primary destinations on as a bigger percentage of GDP than in the States, than in Europe, by a factor of a very large amount. Now, some of this is hype, and some of this is, it is flows of finance running around the world being sucked into hype about Israeli unicorns and, high-tech companies. But there is something real going on there, and it's important because it's one of the obstacles that Palestinians have to overcome is that their withdrawal of labour from those industries, they can't do that because they are excluded from them entirely. Palestinians do work in parts of the Israeli economy, in places in construction. Palestinian citizens of Israel also in services and health service and transport and so on. But they don't form the overwhelming majority of the working class, which is the case, for example, in South Africa under apartheid. The South African black working class was able to paralyse the process of capital accumulation in some of the most dynamic and profitable centres. So, for example, in the mining industry, in diamonds and gold and so on. And it was one of the reasons why the South African ruling class eventually was forced to abandon apartheid as a result of the mass struggles of the black working class. So that element in the way that the Israeli state works is very important. But the dispossession and exclusion of Palestinians from the land of Palestine and from the economy of Palestine also had a massive effect on the structuring feature of the way that the whole system across the region works in terms of capital accumulation. One way is because it created the space, obviously, for this garrison state of Israel, this watchdog for US imperialist interest to emerge. And we can see that in the 1960s, and from the 1960s onwards, from 1967 onwards. But also, Palestinian labour, in fact, the dispossession of Palestinian labour was foundational to the economies of the Gulf. A major component of the migrant workforce that went to build the oil industry in Saudi Arabia was Palestinian. In fact, Saudi Aramco opened a recruiting office in Beirut in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila in 1948, within literally a few weeks of the Nakba happening, in order to suck up a layer of Palestinian petrochemical engineers and people with degrees, and also Palestinian labourers, and take them off to help build the economies of the Gulf. And it wasn't actually just of the hydrocarbons and the oil industry, but also the civil service. Large parts of the education system in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, and other countries in the Gulf were filled with Palestinians. They were forced to do this, however, as a stateless people, as people who were a minority in those societies, who were able to be pushed out of those societies. I mean, the 20% of the population of Kuwait was Palestinian up until 1991, when the Kuwaiti government forced Palestinians to leave because they said that the PLO had supported Saddam Hussein in Iraq during the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. I mean, actually, it was part of a much broader process whereby the countries of the Gulf moved systematically to dispossess and push out the Arab migrant workers who had built their industries, and bring in new layers of migrant workers who were, who could also were also more even more vulnerable to exploitation and oppression. I mean, there's a horrible parallel, of course, here. It's that in the way that Palestinian labour is also used by the Israeli state to build the settlements and agriculture and so on, like I said, but because they're again excluded from the dynamic centres of accumulation on the same scale, they still have that problem inside Palestine, and this kind of points to the importance of those oil industries in the way that the regional system of imperialism works, and that you can't really understand, I think, why Palestine is so important and why the Israeli state is so important to the Western powers, without also seeing it as a kind of mirror image of the Gulf states. That the Gulf states play this pivotal role in the region. They're not the only powers in the region that are that are important. They've increasingly become militarily quite interventionist, destroying destroying Yemen, for example, with the connivance of our own government, supplied Saudi and Emirati air forces with massive amounts of weaponry, and bombarded and subjected to famine millions of people in Yemen. And also these states played a really central role, in fact, in the counter-revolutions that took place after the uprisings across the region in 2011-2012, that it was intervention by the Saudi troops rolled over the border into Bahrain, for example, to crush the uprising in Bahrain. Saudi money flowed into counter-revolutionary projects across the region. Saudi and Emirati money and support, it lies behind the counter-revolution to a degree in Sudan. It's a recent counter-revolution. Hemeti, who's the head of the Rapid Support Forces militia, is a mercenary for the Saudis and Emiratis in Yemen, and has ripped apart Sudan along with the army, the Sudanese army, who are actually backed by another regional power, Egypt. And so on and so forth. So you have this kind of counter-revolutionary role played by the Gulf states. So to come back though to the question of where is the alternative to this, and this is why I think seeing the process of revolution as being something that isn't just about victory on a national scale of the founding of a national state, or even victory on a political scale, where you're talking about a different kind of political system, a democratic political system, one democratic state, as we were talking about in the first session, a state with equal rights for all its citizens, regardless of their nationality, whether they're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, atheist, Buddhist, whatever, that they could live in equal rights and freedoms between the river and the sea. That would be a massive overthrow of the existing system, but without linking to the question of a social revolution and the interests of whose interest is it that the Israeli state persists, the interests of the rulers of Egypt, the rulers of Jordan, the rulers of the Gulf, and Western governments, as well as the Israeli ruling class, that you can't see you can't see a way out of this. And I want to finish up really by talking about the example of struggle in Egypt, because Egypt is obviously a country that borders Palestine, and the Egyptian regime has, since the 1970s, really played a collaborationist role in suppressing the Palestinians' movement, in locking people up in Gaza. The actual peace deal was signed with the Egyptian government signed a peace deal with Israel in 1980. Well, it's 1979 to 1980. The process starts, and since that day, Egypt has been a massive recipient of U.S. arms. In fact, for many years, Egypt was the second largest recipient of US aid and arms after Israel, which gives you a sense of its structural role in what Noam Chomsky called the fateful triangle: Egypt, Israel, and the Palestinians, of keeping the Palestinians fragmented and occupied. But that same army that holds shut the gates of Rafah from the outside is also, its primary function is to oppress Egyptians. That this vast array of military hardware that's sucked into the Egyptian state, and the vast amounts of money that comes with it, not being used for foreign wars, they've been used to maintain a police state and to oppress Egyptians. So you can see the connection that Egyptians feel when they are mobilizing against their own rulers with the Palestinians is something very real. And that one of the things that could make a huge difference in this context of particularly the genocide that's happening in Gaza is if there was a massive movement on the streets in Egypt that could actually really reinforce and support Palestinian resistance from just across the border. What a difference that could make. And you had glimpses of what that could have been like during the revolution in in 2011. We can speak perhaps in the discussion about the question of why did the 2011 revolution not end up like that? But I just want to finish really on the point that this link between the national struggle, the struggle for national liberation, the struggle for democracy, and social revolution, which sees that the fight is going on at a horizontal level between the poor and oppressed in every nation, but particularly in the Middle East, of Palestinians linking up with the poor and oppressed of places like Egypt, of Jordan, or in the Gulf, in a common struggle against the people who oppress and exploit them. That's not an easy argument to make. It requires particular kinds of organisation. It requires a revolutionary organisation that sees that a social revolution is the goal that needs to be fought for throughout a revolutionary process. And that's really where I think socialists as an organised group of people come in. Unless we are organised for that, what Trotsky called a permanent revolution, that leap from the national through to the democratic to a social revolution to get rid of the causes of apartheid, racism, settler colonialism, war, and environmental collapse, that then we won't make that unless we build an organisation, which really is what this is about and why we need you to join us.